Sarah's hands shook so violently that the ultrasound photo, the proof of their baby's tiny heartbeat at 8 weeks, nearly slipped from her fingers as Michael's voice cracked with rage, screaming, "Murderer!" over and over while Catherine stood behind him in that red dress, her hand possessively on his shoulder, watching Sarah's world shatter with cold, satisfied eyes. "Michael, please. Our baby is alive. Look at the picture. Please, just look." Sarah's voice broke into sobs, but he turned his back on her, on their 3-year marriage, on the love letters he'd written calling her his soulmate, because the mistress he'd been sleeping with for 6 months had whispered poison so sweet he chose to believe his wife had disobeyed him rather than admit he'd betrayed her and now wanted to erase the evidence of his guilt. For 5 agonizing years, Sarah heard "murderer" everywhere at family gatherings where his mother spat at her feet, at the grocery store where their former friends whispered and pointed, in her nightmares where his accusations echoed until she woke up screaming. All while their son grew inside her, kicking against her ribs as if trying to tell his father, "I'm here, I'm alive. She chose me over you." 10 years after Sarah disappeared into the night with nothing but her pregnant belly and a suitcase of shattered dreams, Dr. Ethan Mitchell stood over his father's dying body in the operating room, this brilliant young surgeon who'd grown up asking, "Mama, why do you cry when you look at my baby photos?" now holding the scalpel that would save the man who'd destroyed his mother's spirit. Michael had everything the mistress he'd married, the company he'd built, the respect he'd commanded, but he'd never known that the baby he'd ordered Sarah to abort had been born on a rainy night in a clinic 3 states away, where Sarah had screamed through labor alone, clutching that same crumpled ultrasound photo, whispering, "Your daddy told me to get rid of you, but I couldn't. I loved you too much." But how does a man survive learning that every cruel word he screamed at the woman who'd loved him unconditionally was because she'd refused to kill their child, that the mistress he'd married had twisted his guilt into her weapon, that the son he'd wanted erased had been alive, struggling, brilliant, saving lives while he'd been living a lie? Why did Sarah choose to suffer in silence rather than expose the truth? And what had Catherine done that was so evil, so calculated, that it had stolen 15 years from a father and son who should have known each other? What will break Michael more waking up to see his son's eyes, the same eyes Sarah had gazed into on their wedding day, or hearing his boy say, "You told her to kill me. She saved me instead. And now I've saved you because she raised me to be better than you ever were"? It had started 3 years earlier, when Sarah Mitchell was 24 and working as a kindergarten teacher, her classroom walls covered with finger paintings and her heart full of dreams about the family she'd build someday. Michael Harrison had walked into her life like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, tall, ambitious, with eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and a way of making her feel like she was the only woman in the world. He'd shown up at her school to donate computers for the kids, a young entrepreneur building his tech company from nothing, and when he'd knelt down to help a little boy fix a mouse that wouldn't click, Sarah had felt something shift in her chest. Their first date was coffee that turned into dinner that turned into walking through the city until 3 in the morning, talking about everything, his dreams of changing the world through technology, her passion for shaping young minds, the families they both wanted, the love they both believed in. 6 months later, he'd proposed on the beach where they'd had their first kiss, getting down on one knee in the sand while the sunset painted the sky orange and pink, telling her, "Sarah, you're my home, my future, my everything." Their wedding was small but perfect, surrounded by friends who cried happy tears and family who saw how deeply they loved each other. For 3 years, they built a life, a modest apartment that Sarah filled with plants and Michael's mother's recipes. Weekend mornings making pancakes while dancing to old soul music, late nights where he'd work on his laptop while she graded papers, their feet touching under the blanket. They talked about babies constantly, names they loved, how many they wanted, what kind of parents they'd be. When Sarah missed her period that October, she'd taken the test in their tiny bathroom, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. 2 pink lines. She'd wrapped the test in a bow and left it on his desk with a note that said, "Our greatest adventure starts now." Michael had cried when he found it, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around their little kitchen, whispering, "We're going to be parents," over and over like a prayer. But that joy lasted only 3 weeks before everything turned to ash. Catherine Chen had been circling even then, a shadow Sarah didn't see coming. Catherine was Michael's new business partner, a shareholder who'd invested heavily in his company, brilliant and ruthless with an MBA from Harvard and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd started working late with Michael, her hand lingering too long on his shoulder during meetings, her laugh too bright when he made jokes that weren't that funny. Sarah had noticed but pushed it down, trusting the man who'd vowed before God and their families to love her forever. She'd been so naive. When Sarah was 7 weeks pregnant, still glowing with that early motherhood light, Catherine had made her move. She'd invited Michael to a business dinner that turned into drinks, then more drinks, her red dress cut low, her perfume expensive and intoxicating. She'd listened to him talk about his fears a massive deal was falling apart, investors were pulling out, the company was hemorrhaging money, and now there was a baby coming when he could barely afford their rent. Catherine had offered more than comfort that night. In a hotel room that smelled like expensive sheets and betrayal, she'd whispered in his ear, "You don't have to be trapped, Michael. You're too young, too brilliant to be tied down right now. The timing is all wrong." And Michael, drunk on whiskey and fear and the attention of a woman who made him feel powerful when he felt like he was drowning, had crossed every line. He came home at dawn, guilt written all over his face, and when Sarah asked where he'd been, he'd lied. It was the first crack in their foundation, but the earthquake was still coming. 3 days later, Michael sat Sarah down at their kitchen table, his face pale and his hands trembling. The words that came out of his mouth destroyed her. "Sarah, I need you to terminate the pregnancy." She'd laughed at first, thinking it was some sick joke, but his eyes were dead serious. "The company is failing. We're about to lose everything. I can't bring a child into this mess. We're too young. The timing is wrong. We'll have babies later, I promise. But right now we need to take care of this." Sarah had felt the floor drop out from under her. "Take care of this? Michael, this is our baby, our child. You were crying tears of joy 3 weeks ago." But he'd stood up, his voice getting louder, more desperate. "I made a mistake, okay? I got caught up in the moment, but I've been thinking clearly now, and we cannot afford this. You need to do this, Sarah. For us, for our future." She'd stared at the man she loved, searching for any trace of the person who'd knelt in the sand and promised her everything. "No." The word had come out quietly but firm. "No, Michael, I'm keeping our baby." His face had turned red with rage. "You don't get to make this decision alone. This affects both of us. You're being selfish." But Sarah had placed her hands on her still flat belly and said the words that would seal her fate. "I'm keeping our child, with or without you." That night, Michael had slept on the couch. The next morning, he'd moved his things to Catherine's apartment, and 2 weeks later, when Sarah was 10 weeks pregnant and showing him the ultrasound photo that proved their baby was thriving despite his rejection, that's when Catherine's master plan had clicked into place. Catherine couldn't let Michael come back to Sarah. She'd gotten pregnant too deliberately, stopping her birth control the night she'd seduced him. But she was further along now, and she needed Michael to herself. So she crafted the perfect lie, one that would turn Michael's guilt into Sarah's crime. Catherine had shown up at Michael's new apartment with tears streaming down her face, telling him she'd seen Sarah leaving a women's clinic. "Michael, I followed her because I was worried. She went inside, and when she came out 2 hours later, she looked empty. I think she did it. I think she terminated the pregnancy." Michael had gone pale. "No, she wouldn't. She refused when I asked her to." Catherine had gripped his hands, her voice shaking with manufactured emotion. "Maybe she changed her mind. Or maybe she did it to punish you for leaving, to make you think she'd defied you, to make you the villain, when really she did exactly what you'd asked, but won't admit it because now she can blame you forever." It was genius, the way Catherine twisted it. She made Sarah's love, her choice to keep their baby, sound like manipulation. She made Sarah's truth sound like a lie. And when Michael, drowning in guilt and confusion, had gone to confront Sarah with Catherine's accusations, he'd refused to look at the ultrasound photo. Because if he looked, if he saw that tiny heartbeat on that grainy black and white image, he'd have to face what he'd become. He'd have to admit he'd asked his wife to kill their child, that he'd abandoned her when she'd refused, that he'd betrayed everything they'd built for a woman who was now carrying his second mistake. So instead, he chose rage. He chose to believe Catherine's lie. He chose to call Sarah a murderer so he wouldn't have to call himself a coward. The accusations started small but grew like a cancer, spreading through every corner of Sarah's life until there was nowhere left to hide. Michael had gone to his family first, his voice breaking as he told them Sarah had killed our baby. And his mother, a woman who'd once held Sarah's hands at their wedding and called her daughter, had slapped Sarah across the face at Sunday dinner in front of everyone. "You murdered my grandchild, you evil woman, get out of my house." Sarah had tried to show them the ultrasound, her hands shaking as she pulled it from her purse. But Michael's father had ripped it in half, shouting, "We don't want to see your fake evidence. Our son told us the truth." At the grocery store, their former neighbors would see Sarah and literally turn their carts around, whispering loudly enough for her to hear. "That's the woman who killed her own baby." Can you imagine? Sarah's principal had called her into the office 3 weeks after Michael left, his face grave and uncomfortable. "Sarah, parents are concerned about having someone with your situation, teaching their children. I'm going to have to put you on administrative leave." She'd lost her job, her income, her purpose, all while their baby grew inside her, innocent and unaware of the war being waged over their existence. The worst part was church. Sarah had grown up in that church, had sung in the choir since she was 8 years old, had volunteered every Sunday teaching children's Bible study. But when she'd walked in that first Sunday, after Michael's accusations, the whispers had started immediately. After the service, 3 of the elder wives had cornered her in the parking lot, their faces twisted with righteous anger. "We know what you did, Sarah. You took a life. That's a sin before God. You need to repent and leave this congregation until you've made things right with the Lord." Sarah had stood there, her hand instinctively moving to protect her growing belly under her loose dress, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't do it. My baby is alive. Please, you have to believe me." But belief requires trust, and Catherine had poisoned that well completely. Michael had married Catherine in a quiet ceremony at City Hall when Sarah was 5 months pregnant, her belly now undeniably round under the baggy clothes she wore to hide it. Sarah had heard about it from a former friend who'd texted her a photo, Michael in a suit, Catherine in that same red dress, both of them smiling like they'd won something. The text had said, "Thought you should know he's moved on. Maybe you should too." Sarah had stared at that photo for hours, her baby doing somersaults inside her as if trying to comfort her, and she'd realized something that made her blood run cold. Catherine wasn't just pregnant, she was showing too, her hand resting on a small bump in the photo, which meant she'd gotten pregnant around the same time Sarah had, maybe even before Michael had asked Sarah to terminate. The affair had been going on longer than she'd thought. Michael hadn't just betrayed her, he'd replaced her entirely, creating a new family while destroying the one he'd made with her. But Sarah couldn't prove any of it, and every time she tried to tell someone the truth, Catherine's lie was already there, festering in their minds. The breaking point came when Michael showed up at Sarah's apartment at 7 months pregnant, his face haggard and his eyes wild. He'd pounded on the door until her elderly landlord threatened to call the police. And when Sarah had cracked the door open foolishly, hoping he'd come to his senses, he'd pushed his way inside. "Where is it?" he'd demanded, his voice raw. "Where's the proof you actually did it? The medical records, the discharge papers, something that proves you terminated the pregnancy." Sarah had backed away from him, her hands protectively covering her belly where their son was now big enough that she could feel his tiny feet pressing against her ribs. "Michael, I'm telling you the truth. Our baby is alive. I'm pregnant right now." But he hadn't even looked at her body, at the obvious swell of her stomach. He'd been so blinded by Catherine's poison that he couldn't see reality standing right in front of him. "You're lying. You've been lying this whole time. Catherine was right. You're trying to manipulate me, to make me feel guilty, to ruin my new life. Well, it won't work, Sarah. I know what you are. You're a murderer, and everyone knows it. You killed our baby, and you'll have to live with that sin for the rest of your miserable life." He'd left her sobbing on the floor of her apartment, her baby kicking frantically inside her as if he could feel her heart break. That night, Sarah had made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't stay. She couldn't raise her son in a city where everyone believed she was a monster, where Michael's family would eventually discover the truth and try to take her child, where Catherine's lies had built walls so high that truth could never climb over them. So Sarah had packed everything she owned into 2 suitcases and her ancient Toyota, written a letter to her landlord breaking her lease, and driven away in the middle of the night with nothing but $700 in her bank account and a baby due in 2 months. She'd cried so hard during that drive that she'd had to pull over 3 times, her body shaking with sobs that made her son kick in protest. "I'm sorry, baby," she'd whispered, her hands on her belly as she sat in a gas station parking lot somewhere in Pennsylvania at 3 in the morning. "I'm so sorry your daddy doesn't want you. But I do. I want you more than anything in this world. And I'm going to make sure you have a good life. I promise." She'd ended up in a small town in upstate New York, a place where nobody knew her name or her story, where she could start over. She'd found work as a waitress at a diner called Rosie's, her pregnant belly earning sympathetic looks from customers who tipped generously. The owner, a 60-year-old woman named Martha who'd survived her own share of heartbreak, had taken one look at Sarah and known she was running from something. "You got a place to stay, honey?" Martha had asked on Sarah's first day. When Sarah had admitted she was sleeping in her car, Martha had offered her the apartment above the diner for cheap rent. "You can pay me back when you're on your feet. Right now, you need somewhere safe to bring that baby into the world." Sarah had cried in Martha's arms, this stranger showing her more kindness than her own husband had. 2 months later, on a rainy Tuesday night in April, Sarah's water had broken during the dinner rush. Martha had driven her to the county hospital, holding her hand through contractions while Sarah screamed, not just from physical pain but from the agony of doing this alone. There was no husband in the waiting room, no family filling the hallway with balloons and flowers, no one to cut the cord or take the first photo. Just Sarah, Martha, and a tired night nurse who'd seen too many young women give birth alone. When they'd placed Ethan in her arms for the first time, 7 pounds, 3 ounces of perfect, screaming life, Sarah had looked down at his tiny face and seen Michael's eyes staring back at her. The same deep brown, the same shape, the same soul-piercing intensity. Her heart had broken and healed simultaneously. "Hi, baby," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama, and I know your daddy doesn't believe you're real, but you are. You're so real, and so perfect, and so loved." She'd pulled out that crumpled ultrasound photo, the one she'd been carrying in her purse for 9 months, like a talisman, and placed it next to Ethan's tiny hand. The same baby, the same heartbeat. The proof Michael had refused to see was now breathing, crying, living in her arms. For the next 10 years, Sarah had built a life from ashes. She'd worked doubles at the diner until Ethan was old enough for school, saving every penny. She'd gone to community college at night, getting her teaching degree again because she refused to let Michael's lies steal her purpose forever. She'd eventually gotten a job as a 2nd-grade teacher, and Ethan had grown up doing his homework at her classroom desk after school, a bright, curious boy who loved science and asked a million questions about how the body worked. "Mama, why do hearts beat?" he'd asked when he was 6, and Sarah had explained it as simply as she could, watching his eyes light up with wonder. That wonder had never faded. By the time Ethan was 10, he was reading medical textbooks from the library, asking Martha about her arthritis medication, wanting to understand everything about how humans were built and how to fix them when they broke. "I want to be a doctor, Mama," he'd announced one night over spaghetti in their small apartment. "I want to save people." Sarah had smiled through tears, knowing exactly where that compassion had come from. It had been born in the womb of a woman everyone had called a murderer, nurtured by a mother who'd loved him enough to lose everything. But Ethan had also grown up asking the question that haunted Sarah's nightmares. "Mama, why don't I have a daddy? Where is he?" And every time, Sarah had given the same answer, her heart breaking a little more. "Your daddy. He doesn't know you exist, baby. And it's complicated. But I promise you, it's not because you're not wonderful. You're the most wonderful thing in the world." Ethan had become a surgeon at 25, graduating top of his class from Columbia Medical School, on a full scholarship that Sarah had cried over for a week straight because it meant all those years of struggle had been worth something. He'd specialized in cardiothoracic surgery, drawn to the heart like it held answers to questions he'd never asked out loud. And now he worked at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan, the same city his parents had once called home, though he didn't know that yet. Sarah had never told him his father's name, never shown him pictures, never explained the full story, because how do you tell your son that his father had ordered him dead and then called his mother a murderer for refusing? But life has a way of bringing buried truths to the surface, and on a cold February morning, that truth crashed through the emergency room doors on a gurney. Michael Harrison, 58 years old, clutching his chest as a massive heart attack stopped his world, was wheeled into Ethan's operating room while Catherine screamed in the waiting area, her perfectly styled hair falling around her face as she sobbed into her phone. Ethan had glanced at the chart. Michael Harrison. Severe myocardial infarction, requires immediate bypass surgery, and hadn't thought twice about the name because he'd never heard it before. But when Sarah received the call from Martha, who'd seen the news on Facebook that Michael Harrison, tech mogul, was in critical condition at Mount Sinai, Sarah's blood had run cold. She'd driven 4 hours to the hospital, her hands shaking on the steering wheel, knowing that somehow, impossibly, their worlds were colliding after 15 years of careful distance. She'd arrived just as Ethan was scrubbing out, his face exhausted but satisfied because the surgery had been successful. He'd saved his patient's life with hands that shared his patient's DNA. "Mama, what are you doing here?" Ethan had asked, confused to see Sarah standing in the surgical wing hallway, her face pale and her eyes red. That's when Sarah had done the hardest thing she'd ever done. She'd sat her son down in an empty consultation room and told him everything. About Michael, about Catherine, about the abortion he'd demanded and the accusations that followed, about the 5 years of torture and the ultrasound photo he'd refused to see, about the night she'd driven away pregnant and alone, about the man lying in recovery whose life Ethan had just saved. Ethan had sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his brilliant mind trying to process what his heart already knew was true. "The patient I just operated on. That's my father?" His voice cracked on the word father. That concept he'd spent 25 years wondering about now, having a face, a name, a heartbeat, he'd literally restarted. Sarah had nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He told me to abort you. And when I refused, his mistress, the woman who's in that waiting room right now, convinced him I'd done it anyway. He called me a murderer for 5 years for a crime I never committed. He married her. He built a life. And he never knew you were born." Ethan had stood up abruptly, his face cycling through emotions too fast to name rage, grief, confusion, betrayal. "I need to see him." Michael had woken up 2 hours later to find a young doctor standing beside his bed, and even through the fog of anesthesia, he'd seen something familiar in that face. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Dr. Mitchell. I performed your surgery. You're going to be fine." Michael had tried to smile, his voice weak. "Thank you, doctor. You saved my life." That's when Ethan had pulled something from his pocket, a crumpled, faded ultrasound photo, the paper worn soft from years of Sarah, carrying it like a prayer. "Do you recognize this?" Michael had stared at the image, his brain struggling to connect the dots, and then his eyes had widened with a horror so profound it was like watching a man's soul shatter in real time. No, that can't be. Ethan's voice was steady, but his eyes blazed with 15 years of questions. This is me at 8 weeks. My mother showed you this photo, begged you to look at it, and you called her a murderer instead. You told her to abort me. And when she refused to kill your son, you married your mistress and destroyed her life with a lie. Michael had started hyperventilating, the monitors beeping frantically as his blood pressure spiked. No. Sarah was pregnant? You're my son. The words came out strangled, broken. She never had an abortion? The baby was real? You were real? Ethan had leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than any scalpel. I'm real. I've always been real. And the woman you tortured for 5 years? She raised me alone, worked 3 jobs to put food on our table, and taught me to save lives even when the world told her she'd taken one. You told her to get rid of me. She chose me instead. And today, I chose to save you, because that's what she taught me, to be better than the people who hurt us. The truth had exploded through that hospital like a bomb. Catherine, confronted by Sarah in the hallway with 15 years of rage finally unleashed, had confessed everything: the deliberate pregnancy, the fabricated clinic story, the forged documents, the systematic destruction of Sarah's reputation, all because she'd wanted Michael for herself and couldn't let Sarah's refusal to abort stand in her way. Michael's family, who'd spat on Sarah and called her a murderer, had to face what they'd done to an innocent woman whose only crime was loving her child too much to kill him. Michael himself had tried to speak to Ethan, had begged for a chance to explain, to apologize, to somehow undo 15 years of absence, but Ethan had walked away from his hospital bed without looking back. The man lived, his heart fixed by hands that should have grown up knowing a father's love, but he would spend the rest of his life broken by a truth that came 15 years too late. Sarah stood in the hospital parking lot with her son beside her, the winter sun breaking through clouds like a promise that darkness doesn't last forever. Ethan had put his arm around his mother's shoulders and said the words that finally healed the wound Michael had carved into her soul. You chose me when he told you not to. You loved me when he called you a murderer. You made me who I am, and I don't need him, Mama. I never did, because I've always had you. Michael Harrison would recover from his heart attack, but he would never recover from the knowledge that his son, brilliant, compassionate, alive, had saved his life while knowing the truth of his father's betrayal and had walked away because some things, once broken, can't be fixed. The baby he'd wanted dead had given him life. The wife he'd destroyed had raised a man better than he'd ever been. And the 15 years he'd spent living a lie built by his mistress had cost him everything that actually mattered. If this story touched your heart, if you felt Sarah's pain and Ethan's strength, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on that notification bell so you never miss these powerful true stories that remind us what really matters in life. And please, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our family all around the world. God bless you all.